Okay. Hello and welcome to Scotland Votes, the Scotland on Sunday debates. My name's Kenny Farquharson. I'm Deputy Editor of Scotland on Sunday. And every Monday this month, we are getting to the heart of the issues that matter to voters in the Scottish Parliament elections. Today, the subject is law and order. We're in the headquarters of The Scotsman and Scotland on Sunday here in Holyrood Road in Edinburgh, just across the road from the Parliament. And today's debate is being brought to you in association with the public affairs firm Weber Shandwick and the social care charity Quarriers. Today, our subject, as I say, is law and order, and we have with us the justice spokespeople from the four main Scottish political parties. Debating today, we have Kenny McCaskill from the SNP, Richard Baker from Scottish Labour, Bill Aitken from the Scottish Conservatives, and representing the Scottish Liberal Democrats, Robert Brown. Can I ask you please to give them a very warm welcome here today. So, today's debate will work like this. First, each of our participants will have 2 minutes to make their opening remarks. Then each of them will be quizzed by the others. Then there's an opportunity for you, if you're watching at home or at work when the boss isn't watching, to put your questions to the politicians today. Simply find Scotland Votes on Twitter or Facebook, then send in your questions and a selection will be put to the panel. There'll also be an opportunity for our audience here to put their questions too. Then finally, each of our four participants will have 1 minute each to make their closing remarks. So, can I first invite Kenny McCaskill for the SNP to make his opening remarks. Kenny.
Thank you, Kenny. Good afternoon. We've delivered as an administration 1,000 additional officers into our communities. As a consequence, we've got a 32-year low in recorded crime, a reduction in violent crime, and even a reduction in the fear of crime, which matters in our communities. But there's more to be done, and we're not complacent. We're also seeking to break the cycle of reoffending that so damages our communities. That's why we're bringing in tough community punishments, because we know that they work. 3/4 given a short sentence reoffend within 2 years. 2/3 given a tough community sentence don't. We have to change and break that cycle of offending. We're taking actions on victims of crime because we do need to recognise the dignity that has to be shown to those who have suffered. And we are committing going into this election to maintain those 1,000 officers in our communities because we know it works. Boundaries will have to change. Frontline policing cannot be jeopardised. We'll commit to a victims bill to make sure that people get the rights and the access to services. And most importantly of all, to tackle low-level offending and also serious offending. We'll tackle the scourge of cheap booze that so blights Scotland's communities. We've made progress. We've risen to challenges, whether terrorism, court decisions or plural plaques. But there's more work to be done. We hope to work with stakeholders to make Scotland better. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I ask Richard Baker for Scottish Labour to make his opening remarks now?
Thank you, Kenny. Scottish Labour will always put the needs of victims first in our justice system and ensure we have a relentless focus on protecting our communities from crime and from antisocial behaviour. Justice issues have been hotly debated in this Parliament because our views have differed sharply from the Scottish Government in key areas of policy. While we support robust and effective alternatives to custody, the Scottish Government's legislative presumption against all custodial sentences of 3 months and under, whatever the offence, is reckless and underfunded. We believe this Government has let the new laws on antisocial behaviour wither on the vine when people in our communities today want them to be used. We believe the Scottish Government has failed to take the action we need to tackle the scourge of knife crime. But we also know that as a party aspiring to government, it's our responsibility to spell out our alternative. And we believe we have the right policies to make Scotland a safer place, to give victims a voice in our justice system, not only through a Charter of Victims' Rights, but also through a Victims' Commissioner, to give communities suffering from the selfish actions of a minority new protections, with Ian Gray launching this very morning our new 5-point plan to tackle antisocial behaviour. We have joined with the victims of knife crime and the thousands of Scots who want a clear message of carry a knife, go to jail, with minimum mandatory sentences of 6 months custody. We want to tackle reoffending too by driving down illiteracy in our jails and getting the Glasgow Community Court pilot back on track to deliver a new vision for community sentencing which works. We want to protect policing in Scotland from the cuts of the Westminster government. We support moving to a single police force to better police our country and reinvest savings in the front line to protect police numbers and police staff posts too, so that police aren't coming off the beat to do the jobs they used to do. Through devolution, we have made progress in tackling crime in this country. We are determined to secure that progress, not jeopardise it, and we believe we have the ideas to make Scotland an even safer place in the future.
Thank you, Richard. And now we turn to Bill Aitken for the Scottish Conservatives.
We regard the issue of policing as being a very, very vital one indeed. It is true that the government provided these additional police officers, but they would not have done so had they not been forced by the Conservatives in the budget negotiations 3 years ago. Labour did not wish to add any numbers to the police force. At the same time, it has to be recognised that things cannot stay as they are. There will require to be a review of the number of police forces which we have in Scotland, and that will not be detrimental at all to frontline police services. Because the fact of the matter is that even in the most rural areas, the contact which the average person has with the police is with their local commander. It is not a chief constable or an assistant chief constable. Police numbers must be maintained, and we will ensure that that will happen. Secondly, we have to look at the way in which crime profiles are going. Now, certainly the figures look not all that bad for last year, but we have to remember that for around about 10 weeks last year, both at the start and at the end, people weren't going terribly far because of the weather conditions. So we really need to see what happens in the next couple of years before we can be quite satisfied that the level of disorder and violent crime in the streets has been contained. We want to look at sentencing. There's an inherent dishonesty in sentencing, because watching a High Court judge sentence somebody these days requires a calculator. There are so many discounts. The complainer, the victim of a serious assault, seeing someone sentenced to 4 years, does not want to see that guy out in the streets within 2 years. And that has got to be remembered also. We would also go against and reform the views which Kenny McCaskill has expressed regarding short period sentences. Sometimes short sentences are the only thing that work. And it is really facile to suggest that those who do community service are on the same basis as those who get the jail, because the fact is that those who get custody are much further down the line of criminality than the community service clients. So basically, we will be taking a much tougher line than the other parties.
Thank you, Bill. And now Robert Brown for the Scottish Liberal Democrats.
Thank you very much, Kenny. Liberal Democrats believe that a good justice system is in the interest of everyone, of victims, of communities, of the state and of the offenders. Less crime means fewer victims, costs society less and helps potential offenders find more productive lives for themselves. That means good community policing, it means locking up serious criminals, it means rehabilitation of offenders, and it means community payback. We base our approach not on popular slogans, but on what works and what does not work. What doesn't work? Short-term prison sentences don't work. 91% of those who serve in Pullman Young Offenders Institution have been there before. Manifestly, that doesn't work as a deterrent. It costs us also almost £40,000 a year per person to lock people up in prison. Poorly supported community orders don't work either. They need to be speedy, effective and tough. And far too many of them don't start quickly enough, and there's a high breach rate as well. Prisoners not doing work or education prison doesn't work either. And there's only 426 daily workplaces in our prisons, in our industrial prison workshops. What does work? Early intervention works. 40% of 8-year-olds with conduct disorders end up as teenagers committing offences. What does work? Targeted work with gangs and knife violence. That works, as the Violence Reduction Unit has shown very clearly. Typically, many of these projects produce a third reduction in the levels of crime. good community payback orders work. And if we can reduce the reoffending rate there from 42%, less by far than prisons, to say 30%, the benefits for offenders and for the public are very great. And prison reform, structured work and training, that works. We want also to see police reform, but we're strongly against the single police force, which we think is bad for Scotland, bad for democracy, and bad for community policing. We're all for sharing backroom services, making economies when they make sense, but we're against a single police force. And finally, in this connection, we think there needs to be a new Police Act, revising the arrangements made some 40 years ago, as was shown, I think, by the Taser dispute, where the boundary between operational policing and the policy, which rightly belongs to democratic government, was seen to be blurred. All these things, I think, are relevant to the Liberal Democrat approach to these matters.
Thank you, Robert. You've now heard each of the four spokespeople give their opening remarks, and now we're going to turn them on each other. Each of our panellists will be cross-examined by the other three. And first to face questioning is Kenny McCaskill of the SNP. And the first person to ask him a question is Richard Baker.
Thank you. Kenny, how do you square your plans to increase by thousands the number of community sentences with the budget cuts to those very organisations in the voluntary sector with the most success at tackling reoffending, and the decision to scrap schemes like Right Track, which have been hailed as crucial in tackling youth offending?
Well, Right Track was dealt with by the CGA. What we've done is seek to maintain the budget, and we've put an additional $4 million. It's up to the local areas to decide which particular schemes to support. But I think we've shown, and it's been accepted across party, and Robert Brown referred to it in his opening statement, that these early intervention matters do work. So clearly, some schemes have not been supported by local bodies. But as a government, we've put our money where our mouth is, and we are showing our commitment to breaking the cycle of reoffending.
And a question from Bill Aitken, if he can get his voice put together.
Kenny, you changed the Justice Committee view in the whole Parliament with regard to short period sentences. Which offender do you think should not go to jail out of the following? The wife beater, the drunk driver driving whilst disqualified with 2 previous convictions, the shoplifter with 40 previous convictions, and the minor drug pusher. All of these are cases in which a sentence of 3 months or less would quite frequently be imposed.
I think there's 2 aspects. What you've got to remember is that it's a presumption against short sentence. And the reason that it's a presumption is that we were implored by those who work in the domestic violence court that quite often, actually, sometimes what's needed for those who suffer from domestic violence, not just the partners, but frequently the children, have to have some respite care. And we recognise that sometimes what we have to do is just get somebody out of circulation to give them that respite. And that's why we'll always be open to any sheriff to decide to give a short sentence. But on the other matters, it's always been the position in Scotland, and it will always remain under our administration, that the decision about whether to put somebody in prison, give them a community sentence, deal with them by probation or whatever, is a matter for the presiding sheriff. In our democracy, we separate between those who are in government and those who are in the judiciary. So, as I say, we lay out the framework, but it's for the sheriff to make the decision. But he has, and she has, that right to decide whether somebody gets that short sentence or whether somebody gets, as I say, a tough community punishment, or in some instances, it gets the needs and support that they perhaps need to address their fundamental problem, which may be mental health, may be alcohol, or maybe drugs.
Thank you. And finally, Robert's question for Kenny McCaskill.
Thank you very much, Kenny. You are going very strongly on the question of moving away from the current system of 8 police forces. Yet the previous Labour government, before the election, abandoned police amalgamation in England on the grounds it would cost too much. And your government had to dump the figures in the consultation paper because you couldn't get the police to sign up to them. What makes you think that this can be done without huge additional costs, which have accompanied pretty much every reorganisation known to man?
Well, we've delivered 1,000 additional officers, and it's worked. We've got a 32-year low in crime, an 11% reduction in violent crime across the board. It's making progress. We need a visible police presence in our communities. It deters those who would commit crime, and it reassures those who are scared and become the victims of crime. We cannot go on with 8 times chief constables, times fleet management, times procurement, times HR, times communications. we've got to make sure we invest in front-line services. So we're having a consultation. It might be a single force, it could be a regional service of 3 or 4, but we can't go on doing things 8 times over in difficult financial times. The priority is going to be front-line policing, and if that comes as an upset to some senior officers, then so be it.
Thank you, Kenny. Next up to face questions is Richard Baker of the Scottish Labour Party. And first to ask him a question is Kenny McCaskill, the SNP.
Richard, when we came into administration, we recognised the problem with offending and the prison policy of people going in and out on a revolving door. We set up the McLeish Commission under a former Labour First Minister, and he came back with a presumption against short sentences. Ken Clarke, south of the border, is now building upon that and going from 3 months to 6 months. Your leader, Ed Miliband, is quoted as saying that when Ken Clarke says we need to look at short sentences in prison because of high reoffending rates, I'm not going to say he's soft in crime. See, in this coming period, will you not come on board in the general consensus across criminal justice in Scotland and come and work with us in tackling that problem of short sentences that don't work?
Well, Kenny, we're not opposed to robust alternatives to custody and effective community payback. The problem is that we don't believe we're getting that from you. And, of course, we don't support a legislative presumption against sentences of 3 months and under. As Bill Aitken rightly said, that applies across the board. That presumption still applies to offences such as domestic abuse. But on the rest of your question, I've spoken to our Shadow Justice spokesperson in Westminster, Sadiq Khan, on this very issue, and he's told me he wouldn't support a legislative presumption against such sentences. And to be fair, I'm not sure that's what Ken Clarke has brought forward either. It's been brought into law by this Scottish Government. It means that on an arbitrary basis, some 7,000 offenders who had previously been in custody will have a presumption against that sentence. Now, we don't believe we've got a judiciary who send people to jail willy-nilly. Some people are receiving up to 40 offences before they receive a first custodial offence. It's a question of balance. And your plans would require some £20 million per annum to invest in robust community sentences. As you said yourself earlier, you provided just 4. That risks having a less efficient regime and actually reducing people's confidence in the community sentencing system with an increase in breaches, and actually what Robert Brown referred to earlier, a system which too often doesn't work. My final point is this. I'm a huge fan of Ed Miliband. I voted for Ed Miliband in leadership election, but this is an election in a Scottish Parliament. We should be talking about our leaders here. My leader is Ian Gray, and I think we should be able to agree that we should be focusing on the policies we discuss here. Devolution is also, although I agree with Sadiq Khan on what he's been saying in terms of their contribution to Westminster, but devolution is about having a different approach in Scotland. We've done that when we were in government on free personal care, we led the way in a smoking ban. We will never apologise when it does happen for having a distinctive policy agenda.
Thank you. Next question from Robert Brown.
Oh, sorry. I wonder if I can ask, if I may, Richard, about the question of your policies on knife crime. You want, I think, to lock up everybody found carrying a knife for 6 months. That's the policy I think you've put forward. Now, that was something like 1,300 offenders a year. That's the equivalent of another Barlini. Leaving aside the question of whether it works or not, with 3/4 of people reoffending within 2 years from prison, I wonder if you can tell the assembled multitudes today where you get the money from and where you'd find the extra prison spaces for 1,300 additional prisoners.
I'll do my best, Kenny. It's quite a big question. No, but look, the policy isn't about sending ever more people to jail. It's about reducing the toll of knife crime. But even if it was, certainly the idea that it would take another Barlini to do it is absolutely ludicrous. We've got a policy... if I can answer the question, the policy is quite clear. It is a minimum mandatory sentence, except in exceptional circumstances, of 6 months or under. We're talking about a policy for carrying knives when we have a 5-year mandatory sentence in the same way for firearms offences, when far more people are killed in this country with knives than are killed with guns. We simply think it makes sense to have that kind of policy when still have more than 7,000 crimes of handling an offensive weapon every year and 3,000 people convicted. So we believe we do need to change the policy. We need to change the law in this area because the toll of knife crime in this country is still too high. I mean, Robert, you have said that this policy would cost £21 million. That's reflected in your answer, in your question to me as well. The knife crime costs NHS in Scotland £500 million every year. And also, what cost do you put on the lives of people who are being killed by knife criminals in this country? We stand by this policy. It's right for our communities. It's certainly affordable. And not to do it would be to let people down and the tens of thousands of Scots who are calling for this new policy, this new law in our country.
Thank you, Richard. And final question to Richard Baker from Bill Aitken of the Scottish Tories.
Richard, you've come out with quite a few ideas, some of which I frankly agree with, but let's just examine them in a little bit more depth regarding the costings. You have said that you're in favour of police reforms, providing that there are no job losses. You have said that you favour tough community sentences and that more money must be put into them. Where is this money coming from?
Well, I think I'm glad you asked me about the single police force. As Robert asked Kenny as well, I mean, my information about the most recent estimates on the single police force is that, yes, it will be substantial set-up costs, but these will be more than compensated for by the savings we will have every single year by having a single police force. Set-up costs are around £90 million, and actual savings annually of around £150 million. Those savings will be reinvested in the front line to protect police on the beat and to protect key police staff posts as well, such as forensic staff, police custody staff. You know the stuff that I am talking about. Of course there will be rationalisations and efficiencies. We won't need 8 human resources departments. We won't need 8 police complaints departments. We'll not need 8 IT departments. Of course, you're right, there'll be rationalisations there. But certainly, in other parts of the system, it's quite clear there are huge savings to be made, and we will reinvest those in the front line to protect police numbers and to protect police staff posts too.
Thank you, Richard. The next politician to face questioning is Bill Aitken of the Scottish Tories. And the first question to him comes from Robert Brown, the Scottish Labour.
Thank you very much. I wonder if I can come, Bill, on the knife crime question to you as well, because you want to send everybody who's found carrying a knife to jail for 2 years, not just for 6 months. Now, bearing in mind that a snapshot of prisoners who are in jail for carrying a knife indicated that 90% of them had been there for the same offence before, what effect do you think your policy will have on the numbers of people carrying knives?
Well, I think the effect would be that a lot fewer would be carrying knives and there would be a lot fewer victims in Scotland's hospitals and mortuaries. That is the bottom line in that respect. Now, the fact of the matter is, and Richard Baker alluded to this quite properly so, that under the Firearms Act, as you know, the carrying of a gun means a mandatory 5-year sentence unless special reasons can be provided. And there's always got to be the get-out clause, quite rightly so. And in fact, there was an appeal case just a few weeks ago which underlined that, involving a case in Dundee. The fact of the matter is that there are so many unnecessary victims. I have been impressed by the evidence given by John Muir, who lost his son in Greenock, where this young man was out, minding his own business with a few friends when he was set upon and stabbed, and died. A law-abiding young man who had never been in trouble before. There are so many like that. There are some people who simply will not learn the lesson unless the effects of that are fairly dramatic. So basically, under knife crime, what we're doing is simply the same thing as what we would do in respect of firearms, where I have found there's been no particular outcry, where a 5-year sentence is the going rate.
Thank you. Kenny McCaskill, question for Bill Aitken.
Bill, you and I have both expressed some scepticism, if not concern, about decisions made in the European Court with clear implications here. Ken Clark's recently indicated that while he accepts ECHR, he does think the relationship between the European Court of Human Rights and the national courts has to change and be looked at, given that we're into 2011 from a position that came in many years ago. I've indicated a willingness to support him on that. Given that, would you accept that it's perhaps appropriate now that we should have the High Court of Justiciary in Scotland as the final arbiter on criminal appeals, and that it should not be undermined by a London-based UK Supreme Court with no real involvement in Scots law?
I am exceptionally concerned in the way in which matters have gone in recent years. The fact of the matter is that what is Scottish should be decided in Scotland. Now, the old situation whereby in civil matters cases could be appealed to the House of Lords Judicial Committee where there was a national import to these, I think was totally satisfactory. But I've become increasingly concerned about the way in which European court decisions and European legislation is impacting upon Scottish law. And we have had the recent Cadder case, which is an absolute classic example, where I can understand where the Europeans are coming from. Of course I can. They do not wish to see oppressive behaviour on the part of the police or on the courts elsewhere. But Scotland is not Turkey. That could not have happened here. Because the Cadder case came from a case Saldus in Turkey, where a 16-year-old was held in custody for 3 days before being taken before a court. That simply couldn't have happened here. And I think that there's a very strong argument, personally, for matters of criminal import to be finally decided in the Scottish Court of Criminal Appeal, with all the checks and balances that are in place.
Thank you. And the final question for Bill Aitken from Richard Baker. Thanks.
Bill, you asked me about spending commitments, so if I can return the favour. UK government documents have shown the costs of elected police commissioners in England and Wales could be as high as £136 million over 10 years. How much would they cost to introduce in Scotland, as you've proposed?
Well, if you're going to say it's 136 million in England, the obvious calculation would be about 13 million, being 10% of the population, if you were to go down that particular model. But of course, we would not be going down that particular model there. What we would be doing is we would be ensuring that the directly elected commissioner would be operating, or the police commissioners would be operating in a quite different manner to the already expensive system which operates in respect of the joint police boards. So there would be a saving. The difficulty with that particular policy is, of course, the local accountability, but we will put in place remedies in that respect. It should not cost more money. The 13.6 million is a straightforward calculation if you follow that model, and that is not what it would cost.
Thank you, Bill. Final politician to face cross-examination by his peers, Robert Brown of the Scottish Liberal Democrats. First question from Bill Aitken of the Scottish Tories.
Robert, you've been very consistent over the years with regard to the approach to tough community sentences, although how you know that puzzles me, because I don't think we've ever had a tough community sentence in Scotland. But how do you cope with the people, and we had a classic case last week, who turned up in court having had sentence deferred in order that they could be given an opportunity to cooperate? They failed to cooperate. How do you cope with those who are ordered to do community service and don't do that community service? How do you cope with those who are ordered to pay fines and don't pay fines? Is this not an absolutely toothless tiger?
Well, the reality is that it isn't. The substance of the community payback order is, in fact, quite tough. And I think there's many examples of people who've said that they'd actually rather serve that time in prison, frankly, than do a community service order. So there's nothing sort of easy or easy-ozy about the community service orders. Now, there are issues, of course, as there are with any penalty, about enforcement and dealing with things if people breach them. I think a lot of this is actually dealt with if you can have a much more effective start to the order, get the thing off the ground as soon as people have been in court, in the same way as you'd be wheeled off to jail, make sure that it's consistently dealt with, deal with it in terms of proper approaches, management approaches during the time. There's an organisation called Includem, for example, who've got this concept of stickability. Now, stickability means you don't give up on these people. You stick with them, you keep at it, and you make sure that they keep to the order. And, of course, in some instances, people will have to come back to the courts and be, in fact, even in some instances, in prison. Now, nobody said that there should be no short-term sentences. What people have said is we should move away from them towards a much more normal position where it's community community sentences that are in order. Now, the reality is that short-term prison sentences at the moment, 72% of them reoffend within 2 years. Community orders, it's 42%. I'll accept a degree of difference in the category of group. If you could be more effective still in terms of the effectiveness of the orders, I think there's work to be done in that regard because they are patchy across Scotland, then I think you could actually have huge savings for the public purse, for victims and for Scotland generally.
Thank you, Robert. Next question from Richard Baker.
Well, the latest figures on a single police force for Scotland do suggest a start-up cost of around £90 million, but thereafter annual savings of around £150 million. With the UK coalition cutting police numbers and police staff by some 28,000 posts, what's the Liberal Democrats' proposal to protect police numbers in Scotland, given the opposition to a single force?
Well, I think there's huge dubiety about the figures that have come forward in this regard. As I mentioned earlier, the Scottish Government had to actually withdraw the figures in the first instance from the consultation paper because nobody could agree them. We know that in England, the UK Labour Government abandoned police reorganisation in that respect because it was going to cost too much. It's put forward as a solution to the current financial problems, which I think we all know that we suffer from, in large measure due to the legacy left to us by the last Labour Government. But the reality is that there are other ways of doing these things. You can save back office functions. You can have amalgamations. There's no particular reason why a different pattern of police forces should require different organisations for ordering police cars and things of that kind. There are savings to be made by back office amalgamations where this is appropriate, and we're certainly in favour of that. There's also, as we've seen in Strathclyde, in one structure, savings to be made from a flatter structure. And I think we've seen something of that with the knocking out of a number of the superintendents. But at the end of the day, I think it's ludicrous to suggest that you can have a police situation in Scotland where everybody from Orkney and Shetland to Dumfries and Galloway, the police needs of these areas are dealt with from one central place, one location, with one chief constable in and out of the Justice Secretary's office. That's bad for democracy, I think, and it also, I think, is likely to take, at the very, very best, 3 or 4 years at least before it starts to pay off, if indeed it pays off, because certainly local government reorganisations in the past didn't pay off in financial terms.
Thank you, Robert. Final question this round. Kenny McCaskill.
Robert, the SNP government's welcomed the constructive support we've had from the Liberal Democrats in tackling the root causes of crime, support and short sentences, and as you mentioned yourself, early intervention. With over half of those who are murdered or commit a murder being under the influence of alcohol, with over 70% of those who are in Parliament saying it was alcohol that was the fuel. Given the support of Nick Clegg, the Deputy Prime Minister, for minimum pricing, is it not time that the Liberal Democrats put aside the position that was taken earlier and, as we go into a new administration post-2011, commit to minimum price to tackle cheap booze that so blights the communities in Scotland and fuels so much criminal offending, whether minor or serious?
Well, I must give credit to the SNP government for raising the focus on this particular issue, which I think has been a very worthwhile thing. But it's not to be forgotten that the 2005 Act, carried through by the previous Labour-Liberal Democrat coalition, set in place a lot of the mechanisms to improve the surrounding licensing arrangements for happy hours, for these sorts of things in pubs, to improve the setup. What's been done in the new Act goes along the same lines with regard to off-licences. And whilst I think there is a connection between price and consumption, I think the SNP government failed because they didn't come up with actually a convincing narrative as to the difference that this would make at the end of the day. It seemed to me to be marginal, to be dubiously legal, and to have a number of unintended consequences. Now, whilst it may be doable across the UK at that level, and the UK government, I think, are looking at that sort of thing, I think at a Scottish level it raises more problems than it actually solves and has very doubtful effects in terms of the solving the alcohol problems that you and I think, both want to see.
Thank you, Robert. Well, you've heard from our politicians. Now it's time for you to have your say. We have some questions from our viewers online, but I'm looking for some questions from the audience here. If you can kind of, there's a microphone, so if you hold on, wait for the microphone, say who you are, and if you represent an organisation, say what organisation you represent, and we'll get as many questions as we can. So, anybody with questions? What about this chap here?
Thank you. My name is Graham Morton. I'd like to ask the politicians about what should happen to those who have completed sentences for serious sex offences. what is their view of circles of support and accountability? And why are there so many fewer of them? I believe there are just 2 in Scotland, just been set up earlier this year. Why so many fewer of them than south of the border? Is it the case that when it comes to law and order matters in Scotland, populism is a major driver?
Thank you. Well, should we ask Robert Brown, first of all, on that issue?
Yes, I'm supportive of the idea, I must say, of circles. I think it's a relatively new concept as these things go, and I think it's been coming into force across the country. It does require appropriately trained volunteers, and I think it's quite demanding on them as well. And there's a balance in all these things to be struck, as I think Graham is well aware, between the safety of the public on the one hand and the the rehabilitation or whatever and support of the offender on the other. When people come out of prison, clearly in technical terms, they've served the custodial part of their sentence, if you like, but it can be very, very difficult to get them reintegrated. And one of the problems is that the more you drive them underground, the more the likelihood is that they may reoffend. So it needs to have, I think, a close tabs kept on them, and the circles process is a better way in many ways of doing it than some other methods, because it does keep people in touch. It keeps an eye on what's going on, and providing it's combined with a proper risk assessment by the authorities, I think is very much to be welcomed.
Bill, what's the Scottish Tory view on this one?
The issue of sex offenders is always a difficult one, and some of them, quite frankly, will not ever be released from prison, but many will. And what clearly we have to do is, when they are released into the community, we have to ensure that not only is the community safety preserved, but they are given a reasonable chance in order to rehabilitate themselves. As you know, we are very keen that those who are released on licence should be kept under constant supervision. They should be subject to tagging. They should be required to notify their whereabouts, and that could be tried by electronic means. But I certainly think that there might well be merit in the recent schemes which have been proposed. The problem is that they haven't been working long enough for us to accept, for us to be able to gauge their effectiveness. But I certainly think there is merit in the idea.
Thank you. Richard?
I'm sure we all want more to be done to better prepare sex offenders for release back into the community. I know the Scottish Prison Service has just recently reviewed its sex offender treatment programme. I have to say I have some reservations about the plans to close a specialist centre at Peterhead Prison for dealing with sex offenders. That's not something I'm persuaded by at the moment. I think it's also the right time to review the MAPA arrangements and their effectiveness, and I think circles of responsibility would be a good idea to actually include in a more wide review about how we deal with sex offenders in the community, and as Bill said, do all we can to ensure the right arrangements are in place so we can be as sure as possible they won't reoffend.
Okay, thank you. Kenny, yeah?
Yes, I think there's 2 aspects. There's the risk assessment and there's the circles question. On risk assessment, it's quite clear that actually sex offenders are less likely to reoffend than most other offenders. The difficulty is the small minority that do so with catastrophic consequences for individuals, families and communities, and therefore everything has to be risk-based. That's why we have multi-agency public protection arrangements, why we have risk of sexual harm orders. So we have to make sure that wherever possible, it's risk-based, and we're able to differentiate between those who will not reoffend, who are the majority, and those who are a complete danger to our society and do require to be monitored. In terms of circles, yes, I think there's more that could be done by circles of support with sex offenders. But equally, I don't think circles of support is something that should simply be viewed towards sex offenders. It's something that's important towards all offenders, because what is shown to break the cycle of offending, not simply for a sex offender, but for any offender, is first of all to have a home to go to have some employment or matter to maintain your interests during the day, and to have some support, and if it can't be family, at least to be a friend. So the concept is a matter that I support, not just, as I say, in terms of sex offenders, but in terms of young offenders, female offenders and whatever else. But with regard to sex offenders, everything, because of the nature and the risk, has to be risk-based and evidence-assessed.
Thank you, Kenny. Next question from the floor. We've got the chap in the front row here. Have you got the microphone? Thank you.
Paul Moore, Chief Executive of Couriers. My question is to all the panel, which is, given the state of overcrowding in our prisons, given the high level of recidivism that you've all touched upon of people coming out of prison, I wonder if you had a look at the innovation that's coming out of Texas, where a $500 million spend on a new prison was set aside and was invested in diversions away from prison, which has led to a $201 million saving in the first year. I just wonder what the panel's view on that is.
Thank you. Richard, what's your view on that?
Certainly interested, for example, in the idea of social impact bonds, which have already worked well down south. I think in Peterborough prison, they had a scheme there for offenders, and that brought down reoffending. And the basis of that, there's social impact bond investment. And I think that's something we could look at here and look at investing more in here as well. But also, you're right, we do have to look at how we encourage more alternatives to custody and drive down reoffending. There's two issues that I think I talked about earlier on. One's also looking at illiteracy in our jails too. We're very concerned about that. But also, we have opposed a presumption against 3-month sentences, but we don't just leave it at that. We say there needs to be a community court model. Now, when we were in government with the Liberal Democrats in the last executive, we had a pilot community court in Glasgow, which actually Parliament as a whole supported should go ahead in this Parliament. It was unfortunate that the Cabinet Secretary didn't agree. If we're elected, we want to get that pilot back on track, delivering swift and effective community justice in our communities, which we think will be visible and will inspire greater public confidence in the community sentencing system. But of course, funding is important. We have to look at innovative models. Social impact bonds are one way of looking at that.
Kenny, do you want to answer that point about why you cancelled that programme?
There's two aspects. There's the cycle of reoffending and there's the cost of prisons. In terms of the cycle of reoffending, there's nothing in Scotland's DNA and genetically means that we are more programmed to criminality than any other country in Europe in particular. Why then do we have more people locked up than, for example, in Northern Ireland or elsewhere? We are not per se bad people. We have some, and they need to be locked up sometime for the rest of their natural lives. But in the main, we have too many people in prison on short sentences with underlying problems from the social deprivation they came from, alcohol, drugs, mental health, and we've got to break that. And it's shameful that the Labour Party wouldn't support us in the drive of what we've got to break that cycle of offending in terms of short sentences. Equally, in terms of the cost of prisons, you can be as macho and tough as you like in terms of where Richard Baker wants to go. You can lock up as many young laddies for this, that or the next thing and talk tough whatever Richard or Bill want to do. But let's remember, it comes at a cost. Every prison costs upwards of £120 million. Every prisoner costs you £40,000 per annum. They're going to have to build 2 prisons, 4 prisons, 6 prisons to deal with mandatory sentences or whatever else. Where's it going to come from? It will mean less bobbies on the beat. It will be no funding for organisations such as Includem. It will mean we won't be building the homes, the schools, the hospitals that we require in our communities. We are committed as a government to tackling offending, locking up those who need to be in prison. As for the rest of it, it's about time we spent on honest citizens and gave them the houses and hospitals and stopped spending it on building more prisons for those who committed offences, who don't need to be in prison and should pay back in our communities through the sweat of their brow for the damage they've done.
Bill, how many prisons are you going to build?
Well, you see, I'm all in support of the honest citizens. And it's the honest citizens who have their cars and houses broken into, who are assaulted in the streets when they are not in prison that concern me. Because what is not in the equation, because we cannot identify this, is the number of crimes and offences which would be committed by people who are not in prison who should be. Now, I'm all for reducing prison numbers, where that can be it can be done in a demonstrable manner, reducing offending and risk to the public. Now, the community court was actually my idea, and it was on the basis of what I had seen in New York City, where it was remarkably effective. No messing about. You do your community service, you don't do your community service. Right, we'll discuss it again once you come back from Rikers Island Jail, where you're spending the next 14 days. The result is that everybody does their community service. That message has got through. You don't mess with the community court. So, therefore, it does initially cause more custody. It does have that cost. But when it cuts summary crime, as it has, in central New York by 48%, surely it is worthwhile trying in Glasgow, where I'm certain that we could get the same result. The problem is that you cannot argue a negative. And the fact is that an awful lot of crimes and offences are committed by those who would actually have been locked up in a different environment. And remember, That is unnecessary victims. That is unnecessary cost to the community overall. So we've got to, it's a difficult equation, but I'm convinced that the Scottish Government has not got it right. And I rather think that my suggestion would be rather more respected by the electorate than what is being proposed.
Robert, how do you address the chap from Quarrior's point?
Yes, I mean, I will concede to Bill one point, that obviously if people are locked up for the period of them being locked up, they aren't going to be committing offences. But they're locked up for 6 weeks. The respite to a community is not really that great in the overall scheme of things. And when you're dealing with reoffending rates and been there before rates in the 90%, 90-odd% of people in Polmont, when I went to visit, according to the Governor, had been there before. That's 16 to 21-year-olds, for goodness sake. You get the same sort of thing with regard, as I mentioned before, of the knife offences. Those who have been locked up for carrying knives, over 90% of them on a snapshot, admittedly, had done the same thing before. Now, manifestly, these policies do not work. And if they translate into overcrowding in prisons, as we know they do, because we've been breaching the safe operational limits in prisons far too often, then you can inhibit, to a much greater extent, what you can actually do with the long-term prisoners who form the greater threat to society. So we've got to deal with that. The difficulty is that reducing the overcrowding to kind of, design levels, if you like, doesn't actually save very much money in itself, because all you do is save the food and clothing, if you see what I mean. It doesn't actually get you too much advantage. So you've got to be able to have some sort of drive forward that gives you the ability to change in the configuration of the prison estate over time, to do it differently, and to reinvest in more effective sanctions like community centres. And I do agree with the support for the Glasgow Community Court, which I think was a misfortune that it didn't go ahead under the aegis of the present government.
Thank you. A question now from one of our viewers online, asking a question that's been one of the main talking points in the justice world over the past, in the course of the SNP's administration. That's the one about the release of Lockerbie bomber Al Megrahi. Question from the internet is, did the decision to release Al Megrahi affect Scotland's standing in the global community? Richard, what's your view?
Well, we believe it certainly did, and we believe that it was a wrong decision which Kenny made to free Megrahi on compassionate grounds. We said at the time we didn't feel that it was the right decision on the basis of the medical evidence which was provided, and all the medical evidence still hasn't been provided, on the basis also of other important aspects of the SPS guidance in terms of length of sentence served and the gravity of the crime. We clearly believe it was the wrong decision. We got a lot of flack at the time for taking that position, but I think well over a year after that decision was made, I think our position has been proved to be the correct one. And we also disagree with the way in which it was taken. I don't think Kenny should have visited Megrahi in prison. He talked to victims of the families of the victims in America by teleconference call, but he actually gave a face-to-face meeting for the person making the application. That's unprecedented and wasn't sensible. So I'm afraid it was a difficult decision. I accept it's a difficult decision, but I don't think it was taken in the right way. I think ultimately it was the wrong decision.
Bill, what's your view?
I think it was a wrong decision, and I think it has adversely affected Scotland's reputation. I certainly think it was an honest decision, but I think it was decidedly misguided, and I think the events have proved that. On the basis of the medical evidence upon which Kenny McCaskill instructed this release, Mr Megrahi should have been dead in October of 2009, and here he is, as far as we are aware, still alive today. Now, it was a difficult decision, because we do pride ourselves in having a degree of humanity. But had I been making that decision, I would have kept Megrahi in jail until his illness had entered its terminal form. I would then have had him released to an address in Scotland, where his family probably had been living in Newton Mearns. There would have been a cost to that, I accept. But for the final week of his life, his family could have complete access to him. That is as far as I would be prepared to show mercy to the biggest mass murderer in Scotland's judicial history.
Robert, did we show too much liberal compassion to Al Megrahi?
Well, I think there's a balance. I mean, as Bill rightly says, this was one of the worst crimes in Scottish judicial history. And if you have to make a balance in these matters, it's difficult to think of anyone that you wouldn't release on these grounds if you release Mr. El Megrahi. And I think that's the difficulty that there was with Kenny MacAskill's decision. I do accept it was within the realm of reasonable decisions. It was one that could be made on the facts. But I think it was actually fouled up by the visit to Greenock Prison, which actually got into the rather dubious territory of, are we actually suggesting to him that he gives up the appeal in order to be allowed to have compassionate release? And one of the problems about all of this was that there was behind it the outstanding appeal following on the Criminal Cases Review Commission's recommendations, which had not been dealt with by the Scottish Criminal Appeal Court, and which meant that the relatives never got whatever degree of finality could come from all of that. And it did seem to me, I must confess, that it was not terribly a good idea to actually link in by this personal appearance in the Sheriff Court, very much unprecedented, in the prison rather, unprecedented by a Justice Secretary as it was, the kind of suggestion of release along with doing away with the appeal. That seemed to be very, very bad, and it's that rather than the decision which I think has caused doubt about the effectiveness of the Scottish judicial system.
Kenny MacAskill, any regrets?
Well, it was my decision. It wasn't an easy decision. It's not been a decision, as you said, without consequences for me and indeed for others. But I believe it was the right decision, and it was made for the right reasons. I made it quite clear it would be a decision that would be made without consideration of political, economic or diplomatic criteria. And that's how it was made. Equally, what we've seen before and since is some gross hypocrisy. Neither I, the First Minister, nor any other member of the Scottish Government colluded in a tent in the desert seeking deals and procurement for oil. And post what's seen happen in Egypt, none of us have been parading around countries seeking to ferment arms trades following upon that. So, as I say, it's a decision that was a hard one, that has consequences for me and indeed for others. But it was the right decision for the right reasons, and it's for others to account for their blatant hypocrisy and shallow partisanship.
Thank you, Kenny. Another question from the audience. A chap in the front row here. Just wait for the microphone. No, come on, but so that people can hear you otherwise. Good.
Hi, just to get a question across. You were talking about people reoffending for prison and that. Well, my opinion on that is people who go into prison and have reoffended, when they're going into prison, they're going to come out and knowing fine well what they might reoffend again. So I think getting courses and places put in forward for people who have been in prison to come out, voluntary stuff, even if it is voluntary stuff, to get them on courses, so it doesn't give them the opportunity to be committing crimes and that. So I think you're talking about putting money into police forces and all that. I think some money for that should go into the communities, what are most at crime level kind of thing. And I think putting much money into that to the community can help and will help the community. So I think, to be honest with you, prison sentences are, some people who get 6 months from that is not enough. I think to get the message across, it should be more lenient. So
thank you.
That's what.
Kenny, can you guarantee that the programmes that we're talking about here will be protected in the tough public spending review?
Well, the prison service does their best, but what you've got to remember is that the prison service can only work with people that they've got for a reasonable period of time. You can't address somebody's illiteracy or the lack of numeracy, their dyslexia or whatever, if you've got them for 4 weeks or 6 weeks. You can make a start. You can patch them up and mend them. You can address their health problems, do their teeth or whatever. But the prison service can deal with those who we have to give a short prison sentence to for respite care in terms of what I said earlier about domestic violence. But if you have somebody for a short sentence, all you can do is corral them. That's why what we've got to do is to treat those who need treated in the community. Those who need to be in prison because they're a danger to our communities or they've done an offence that, frankly, no other sentence can mark but a prison sentence, then they go in. The prison service will have them for a sufficient period of time to be able to address their underlying problems. That's why we've got to tackle short sentences. That's why we brought in McLeish to have a coherent penal policy. Those who need to be in prison, put them into prison, as you say, if need be, for longer. Those who don't need to be in prison, deal with them in the community. Not only is it better, it's cheaper, and that's important.
Richard. Absolutely. Richard, what's your view?
Yeah, I think we shouldn't have an approach where prison's just a scoosh and people should just be in a cell 23 hours a day. Sometimes from what Kenny says, you think that's inevitable. And I think actually there's quite a lot you can do with somebody if they're in for 3 or 4 weeks. There's quite a few courses for serious prisoners last a short amount of time. So we should be doing more with people when they're in custody, but more when they're out of custody too, and when they're released from custody. Now, Kenny would have you believe that his plans are great because it is, he's been maintaining investment in the voluntary sector, in the great organisations we have like SACRO, Apex, and include them, and that the resources are there to do what you want to do. The sad fact is, let alone protecting investment in this, as you said, Kenny, in fact, the investment in these kind of organisations and programmes, it's already cut. Now, it's cut under your government, a budget from which you're responsible. The thing is, the practice is there, as you say, for example, that the SACRO and Apex schemes meeting people at the gates of prison when they're released, and then continuing to support them after that process, so they're not just abandoned back into the community and before. Great schemes to tackle reoffending and employment, for example, for Action for Children as well. I mean, there are great schemes there. We need to do all we can to support them.
Bill, can we cut down on reoffending?
Yes, we can. And, let's face it, that I often feel that we don't do enough for prisoners with regard to rehab whilst in prison. Yep. But, of course, it takes two to tango. And the fact of the matter is that an awful lot of them are quite happy to lie flat on their back in their cells, smoking fags and watching daytime television. Now, there has got to be some sort of incentive for them to actually take some of the courses that are on offer. And of course, this comes back to the fact that we have the automatic early release. Perhaps if the release date had some relevance to how they had cooperated during their spell in custody, more might be able to take up the opportunities which exist. If you're saying that the opportunities are not there as they should be, I think that is an arguable case I would accept.
Thanks. Robert, your final remarks on this?
Yes, I think this is an important issue, and it's important at all levels. I agree with Kenny entirely about the relative cost, because it costs about $40,000 a year per person to keep a person in prison, and anything up to maybe £3,000, £4,000, £5,000 a year on the community payback orders, which is obviously much more effective, particularly if the reoffending rates are better. I think all of us, frankly, have got a lot of work to do on the transition out of prison. And one argument I'm particularly at odds with the Scottish Government about is the approach they've taken towards the open estate, because open estate is there really to prepare prisoners for release, to make sure that when they come out, they've had a degree of progress on that particular route, that they're as prepared as they can be. And of course, the Scottish Government, or the Scottish Prison Service, with the collaboration of the Scottish Government, are closing the major part of the open estate, which I think is a very short-sighted measure in that regard. We need to be able to have measures, I think, in prison that keep people, not as Bill rightly says, I think, sitting on their backsides in their cells all day, and in fact, many of them do just precisely that, but working or having skills education in a structured way during the prison day, and then being supported during the release period, because so many of them come out, particularly from shorter-term sentences, but longer-term sentences as well, without the support in place, go back to their old habits, their old communities, and frankly, you're no better off for all this large expenditure of money by keeping them there in the first place. We've got to do better on that.
Thank you, Robert. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've come getting to the end of our debate today, and each of our participants has 1 minute to give their closing remarks. First person for the closing remarks, Kenny McCaskill with the Scottish National Party.
Thank you. We're running on a record that's one we're proud of. 1,000 extra officers and a 32-year low in recorded crime. We're running on our team. It's not just the First Minister, it's all those who work in criminal justice and law enforcement, police, prisons, procurators, sheriffs and judges, the voluntary sector. Together, they do a great job for Scotland. We've got a vision of making Scotland a better place, tackling the underlying social inequalities that fuel so much problems, tackling serious and organised crime that's a threat in so many of our communities, and tackling so much of the underlying problem, the cheap booze that fuels so much disorder. Together, we can make Scotland a better place. We can add to that record, and it's time to give us another 4 years.
Thank you, Kenny. Summing up for the Scottish Labour Party, Richard Baker.
Kenny, it's been a good opportunity to debate the future of justice policy in Scotland. On May the 5th, Scotland faces a key choice on what road we take to ensure our citizens, our families live in safe and flourishing communities. Scottish Labour wants a justice system which ensures fair and equal access to justice for all, where the needs of the victims come first and their voices are heard. We don't want a blind eye turned to antisocial behaviour, but more action taken to deal with it. We challenge those who have resisted our calls to reduce knife crime through the Carry a Knife, Go to Jail campaign, to listen to the tens of thousands of Scots and the families of the victims who demand it. We want to see a system of community sentencing in which the public can have confidence. We want to protect police on the beat in our communities and won't follow the example of the Tories at Westminster who are cutting police numbers by thousands. Instead, we'll reform our police service to better serve Scotland and reinvest savings in the front line, protecting local policing. This is our vision for a safer Scotland and a more just Scotland, and we look forward to taking it to the people.
Thank you, Richard. Closing statement for the Scottish Conservatives from Bill Aitken.
Our justice policy is predicated on one issue and one issue alone: the victims. Because they are the people who are entitled to the consideration of politicians. They are, after all, the people who suffer. We will support measures by any government which does defend the victims, just as we have supported and were instrumental in getting the 1,000 additional police officers, just as we have supported the Labour Party when they have brought forward sensible proposals with regard to sentencing. But we do have to look at this question of sentencing. We do have to make a justice system that is transparent and honest and respected. It is respected at the moment, but it would be very much more respected if people actually knew what was happening. If the victims and the potential victims of crime knew that we were backing them. That is the attitude of the Conservative Party. That is what we have sought to do over the last 4 years and have done in good measure. And that is what we will continue to do.
Thank you, Bill. And finally, summing up for the Scottish Liberal Democrats, Robert Brown.
Thank you very much, Kenny. I think that most people in Scotland are not that interested in visions, in slogans, in populist gestures, in sending messages. What they're interested in is what works to stop and reduce crime. And the reality is that the tired, old, hackneyed phrases that we've seen, particularly, dare I say it, from the Labour and Conservative parties over the years, do not work. They lead to prison overcrowding, the highest prison population in Europe, as has been said. They lead to ineffectiveness in response, and they lead to prison policies which are not suitable and not adapted for purpose. Liberal Democrats want to see a different approach on which, in fairness, we've made some progress over the past 4 years. That relates to trying to deal with the causes of crime. Where have we heard that slogan before? Dealing with the causes of crime, trying to tackle the things which make people offenders in the first place. Yes, we have to lock people up for long periods for committing serious offences. We do that for the safety and security of the public. With regard to those who are more at the lower level or nuisance level end, we want to see them reformed and rehabilitated so that they trouble the public no more. That is the approach we have to take, and that's the way in which we have to approach the issues that we face about policing, about prisons, about community sentences, and about our whole approach to criminal justice. That's the proper way forward. That's the Liberal Democrat way.
Thank you, Robert Brown. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our debate today. I think you'll agree it's been a very illuminating discussion on some of the topics that are going to be at the heart of the Scottish election campaign as we head for May the 5th. Next week, our subject is health, and with us will be Nicola Sturgeon from the SNP, Jackie Baillie from Scottish Labour, Ross Finney from the Scottish Liberal Democrats, and Murdo Fraser from the Scottish Tories. That's next Monday, 21st of March, at the slightly earlier time of 12:30 p.m. Until then, from the headquarters of Scotland on Sunday and the Scotsman in Holyrood Road, Edinburgh, goodbye.